Peanuts cartoon showed Peppermint Patty talking to Charlie Brown. She said, "Guess what, Chuck? The first day of school, and I got sent to the principal's office. It was your fault, Chuck." He said, "My fault? How could it be my fault? Why do you say everything is my fault?" She said, "You're my friend, aren't you, Chuck? You should have been a better influence on me." A mother took her young son shopping. After a day in the stores, a clerk handed the little boy a lollipop. "What do you say?" the mother said to the boy. To which he replied, "Just put it on my credit card." Another mother was taking her little boy to school since the dad had to go to work early. The little boy kept looking around on the way to school. Halfway there, the little boy said, "Mom, where are the idiots?" Mom said, "What do you mean?" "Well," said the little boy, "usually Dad and I see at least 3 or 4 idiots on the way to school." That's what Debbie was referring to, what we saw. When Mahatma Gandhi was the spiritual leader of India, he was asked by some missionaries, "What is the greatest hindrance to Christianity in India?" His reply was, "Christians." Now, what do all of these illustrations and this reference to Gandhi have in common? You see, there is something we all have, and it is something that can be used for good or bad, but we all have it, and it's called influence. Those who possess the qualities of the Beatitudes are salt and light. John Stott wrote, "If the Beatitudes describe the essential character of the disciples of Jesus, the salt and light metaphors indicate their influence for good in the world." We must remember, we must never forget, that the church and the world are distinct communities. It is earth versus us. It is the world versus the Christians. The theme of this year's Affirming the Faith seminar was the Sermon on the Mount. And yesterday, we heard a lecture on this text, our text this evening, Matthew 5:13-16. We heard a lecture given by Peter Tickner. Peter is a South African who now preaches in Australia. He has a beautiful, beautiful South African accent. He made some very good points in his lecture. And one thing that he noted was that as we look at this text, and Jesus talking about salt and light, that there is a presupposition. To say that we are salt and we are light presupposes that the world is decaying. It needs salt. And that the world is dark, that it needs light. Read with me our text, Matthew chapter 5, verses 13-16. "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." Jesus speaks of salt. Salt and light. The Roman senator Pliny, who lived about AD 62 to 115, wrote, "Nothing is more useful than salt and sunshine." He could have, in essence, been saying, nothing is more useful than salt and light. But Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, points out that Jesus does not say, "You must be the salt." He said, followers of Jesus are the salt. When we become disciples of Jesus, we must fulfill the role of salt and light in the world. Well, you've heard the expression, worth one's salt. What does that mean? It means you're worth one day's pay. And our word salary derives from the Latin word salarium. Salt is the Latin word for salt. Now, there is some debate over the origin of the word salarium, but most scholars accept that it was the money allowed to the Roman soldiers for the purchase of salt. Some think that the Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt. Some disagree with that. But the Roman soldiers were paid money to buy their own food, their weapons, and so forth. And so the soldier who was worth his salt, there's a connection there with that word salt. Salt today is valuable. Despite the fact our doctors keep telling us to reduce our salt intake, salt is very valuable to us. We can't do without it. And a couple of battles of the Civil War were fought over Saltville, Virginia. It fits its name. It was the largest supplier of salt to the Confederate Army. Someone estimated, and I don't know how you come up with this kind of estimate, that 40 million tons of salt are required each year to fill our needs. That is the worldwide need. That's a lot of salt. The human body contains about 4 ounces of salt. Without enough of it, muscles won't contract, blood won't circulate, food won't digest, and the heart won't beat a beat. Encyclopedias say that salt has some 14,000 functions. But many writers believe that Jesus had in mind 2 basic functions of salt: as a seasoning and as a preservative. Probably the main use that Jesus has in mind is that of salt as a preservative. Christians are a preserving influence in a decaying world. So Jesus says you are the salt of the earth. Christians have an influence on the world around them by who they are. But notice that Jesus then says, if the salt loses its saltiness, can it be made salty again? Now, your salt in that nice little canister, whether it be the name brand or whether it be the generic, have you ever had some that you said, oh, it's been here 3 years, it's out of date, it is no longer going to be salty? No. Our salt doesn't really lose its saltiness, does it? Because it is pure 100% salt, maybe with iodine added. What you had in ancient times, especially in the area where Jesus lived, was salt that was basically harvested off of the shores of the Dead Sea. It's very salty. You don't have to know how to swim to get into the Dead Sea. You are just going to float. It's so salty. But in that salt would be other chemicals and minerals. It was not 100% pure sodium chloride. And so, over the course of time, the actual salt could evaporate, leaving a substance that looked like salt, but wasn't salt. It didn't taste or have the preserving power of salt. Tasker observed in his commentary, Christians are to be a moral disinfectant in a world where moral standards are low, constantly changing or non-existent. Saltless salt is useless, except maybe as a road surfacing material. And that is what Jesus says here. What do you do with salt that isn't salty? You can't make it salty again. All you can do with it is throw it out And you do want to be careful where you throw it. If there's a little salt left in it, you don't want it out where you have crops. That will do damage. But if you just throw it out on the roadway or where people walk, they'll just trample it into the ground and won't do any harm. A.B. Bruce wrote, "But what a downcome from being saviors of society to supplying materials for footpaths." That is what happens to the Christian, or to a group of Christians, if they lose their salt, if they lose their influence for good. Yes, Christians are to have a preserving influence in the world. Christians are to prevent spiritual decay. And as we know, salt can have a sharp or biting quality. Have you ever gotten salt in a wound? It burns. Emmett Thielich said to look at some Christians, one would think that their ambition is to be the honeypot of the world. They sweeten and sugar the bitterness of life with all too easy conception of a loving God. But Jesus did not say you are the honey of the world. No, we're the salt. We have a preserving influence. Sometimes that preserving influence can even be a bit unpleasant, very unpleasant, to those who oppose what is right. Jack Lewis wrote, "The common proverbial expression, salt of the earth, expresses a compliment, but here Jesus is challenging rather than complimenting. Christians should be the preservers of society. We are to be the salt of the earth." But along with that comes a second illustration. You are the light of the world. This illustration of salt is mainly negative. You're preventing what is bad. Light is mainly positive. We have a dark world spiritually. All kinds of bad things going on. Sin seems to be rampant, doesn't it? Immorality becomes more and more accepted. Where you have darkness, you need light. And Christians are that spiritual light to a sinfully dark world. Martin Lloyd-Jones said, "You are the light of the world," is one of the most astounding and extraordinary statements about the Christian that was ever made. Jesus, in fact, here uses two illustrations. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. In ancient times, in the area where Jesus was, a common thing was for a town or city to be built on a hill, on a high place. There were two good reasons for that. One was agricultural. You didn't want to build the city on the good land where you would plant crops. There was also the defensive purpose. If you're up on the hill, you're able to look out and see the enemy coming. It's easier to defend the hill, and especially if you got a city with walls. You didn't want to encumber cultivatable land. The city set on a hill brings back memories from one of my dad's sermons. Now, I listened to my dad preach for about 18 years, maybe even 19. And if you're going to ask me, what did he preach? There's a whole lot I can't repeat and tell you. But I remember several illustrations. He didn't use a lot of illustrations, but I remember one of them, and he must have been preaching on this text. He referred to his own boyhood and looking out from their farm over to a mountain, we might call it a hill, but a mountain some distance away, and up on top of it were some lights. He would use that as his illustration. We can think of some other illustrations similar to the city on the hill. Scott and White Hospital Complex in Temple. You can see it a long ways off if you're in the right place. And now we have that little bitty power plant over in Riesel. You can see that thing from Waco and from a distance other directions. And yes, very, very soon, we're going to be able to see wind turbines as we approach Mart. These things are visible because they're high. And if you have a city on a hill, it's going to be visible from a distance. Jesus says that's the way light is. It's like the city on the hill. You can't hide it. And the light that the Christian has, if it's shining, it cannot be hidden. But there is the risk of hiding one's light. And Jesus switches to a more specific source of light, the lamp. The lamp would have been a little earthenware bowl. Maybe a crude form of Aladdin's lamp, but it's just basically almost like a little dish. And in that you would put olive oil and you would have a wick. You would light that, and that was your light source in your house. And in many houses, which were usually quite small, you might just have the one lamp. Kind of remind me of some of our old houses when electricity first came in. You had the one bulb hanging from the little room. But you'd have this one light. If you had only one lamp, would you put it under a bowl or a bushel? Would you try to cover up the light? No. You would put it probably on an elevated place. In some houses, there was a little ledge that came out of the wall. But you would put the light up high so that it could light the entire room. And Jesus says, in the same way, let your light shine before me. Don't hide your light. Let it shine. We have that familiar children's song, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. It's a good principle. I don't know whether you've ever heard it, but Billy Graham was quite the preacher. He apparently did not have much ability in singing. Because George Beverly Shea and the song leader one time recorded a thing where they were singing this little light of mine, and the only part that Billy Graham could sing was when they said, let the devil blow it out. He said no, and said it right on cue, but that was his musical ability. We don't want to let our lights be hidden. One Christian group sang a song that said, shine, make them wonder what you've got. If we're letting our light shine, people who don't have that light will say, what do you have that I don't have? A professor was closing his class for the day. He said, are there any further questions? One student spoke up, yes, I have a question. What's the meaning of life? Everyone laughed and gathered their books. What a question for the end of class. The professor sat and thought for a moment. Are you serious? When the student nodded, the professor took a small piece of glass out of his pocket. It was a piece of a mirror that had been shaped by scraping its edges into a smooth circle. The professor thought for a minute, letting the light from the mirror play across the ceiling and on the faces of the students. Then he spoke. I found this when I was a kid and scraped it against a rock until I shaped it. I was fascinated with it because I could hold it and reflect light into the darkest corner of a room with it. One day I realized this was like my life. I decided to spend my life just reflecting the light into as many dark places as I could. As Christians, we need to be making sure our light shines into the dark places. Years ago, the communist government in China, commissioned an author to write a biography of Hudson Taylor with the purpose of distorting the facts and presenting him in a bad light. They wanted to discredit the name of this consecrated missionary of the gospel. As the author was doing his research, he was increasingly impressed by Taylor's saintly character and godly life. And he found it extremely difficult to carry out his assigned task with a clear conscience. Eventually, at the risk of losing his life, he laid aside his pen, renounced his atheism, and became a believer in Jesus. Taylor was letting his light shine. He was salt. Someone asked, if your church was removed tomorrow from your neighborhood, from the community, would anybody notice? As the church, we must be salt.